All right, it's time for the NetConf working group session. So let's get started. Um, this is the first hybrid meeting for all of us, and I'm sure we're all trying to get used to the system a little bit. So bear with us if not everything quite works perfectly as you would expect. Okay, um, this is the 113 meeting for NetConf. Here is the familiar note well. I'll give you a moment to just quickly glance through it. There is also a link at the bottom in case you want to read it in more detail. Okay, moving on. Um, Couple of administrative things for people who are in the room first. Do remember that you need to sign in to MeetEcho um, for it for you to not only speak to the mic but also to be registered as a participant in Blue Sheets. So make sure you do that. There are a couple of QR codes around the room that you can use to log in. Also, even though you're in the room, you're supposed to join the queue in Meet Echo before you speak into the microphone. So do remember to do that. For remote participants, do turn off your audio and video unless you're presenting or asking a question. And using use of a headset is highly recommended. Blue Sheets we already talked about. We do have a chat window which you'll see next to the attendee list on the left. You can use that to communicate. Um, there is also a notes window that you can open into a separate tab from the menu bar at the top right. And while some of us here in the room will be taking some notes, I would highly encourage people sitting remotely if they could add their understanding of what's happening to the notes section. It's been pre-populated with the agenda for NetConf. Jabber, if anybody is on Jabber, whatever they type should show up in the chat window of MeetEcho. All right. Uh, we have a 2-hour slot for today. We'll try to help the presenters along with the counter that will show at the bottom of the screen for them to know when their time is up. We don't expect to have to cut off anyone either on presentation or questions, but if we have to use it, we'll use it. We talked about the queue. Do remember to queue yourself in MeetEcho before speaking. To speak, use the icon with the play symbol, and remember to remove yourself from the queue once you're done speaking. We talked a little bit about the note taking. If you don't have the link, I have put that at the bottom, the last bullet, but it's also available in the menu bar on the top of MeetEcho. All right, so status of liaisons, and at this point, let me hand it over to Kent to talk a little bit about the liaison statement with IEEE.
Yes, thank you, Mahesh. So IEEE 802.1 reached out to NetConf Working Group about half a year ago with regards to the key store draft, and in particular some language with regards to promoting or copying private keys from um, built-in or system data store to running data store. And just on a couple weeks ago, Rob Wilton and myself attended the youngsters meeting on March the 10th. This was during the IEEE 802.1 plenary. And we had a good discussion. I thought it lasted for about 10 minutes or so. And the action items that came from that was one, first for Rob to send a liaison response with regards to general conformance when dealing with multiple standards or standards spanning multiple SDOs. There was three items for myself. One, to ensure the key store draft adequately indicates what kind of key is being referred to on a case-by-case basis. Second, to amend the key store draft to indicate that built-in keys should not be clear text. And lastly, to ensure that the cryptotypes draft adequately defines what is meant as a hidden key. And then lastly, Mick Seaman from IEEE would ensure that those draft updates addressed his concerns. So the actual impact would be, of course, the updating of the key store draft and potentially also the crypto types draft. So that's all I wanted to say about this. But I know that Scott Mansfield, who's part of the IEEE group, is in the room and maybe would like to say something as well. Or yes, go ahead, Scott.
I don't want to bust in line. Rob has something to say first, and then I can
Oh,
close off.
sorry, I didn't see the queue order. You're right. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, go ahead and use the.
You're Rob Wilson, Cisco. So, yes, I think Kent sort of sums it up well. I think it was a good discussion. In terms of liaison response, I raised this with the ISG and IAB, suggesting that I'd write this response. They were quite happy with that, so I think that's fine. I think it might end up coming from the working group, but I'm happy to work on the text and then work out what the exact process is. And probably we can run it by Scott and Mick beforehand to check that they're going to be happy with what we're writing there as well. Thanks.
Perfect. Scott, did you want to say or add something?
Yes, Scott Mansfield Erickson also works on Liaison and such. The I first off wanted to really thank Rob and Ken for reaching out and trying to get this issue resolved. The IETF IEEE liaison officer, I believe, is Russ Housley, so we should include him to make sure that it goes through the right proper channels. If you need any help from me, since it is an 802.1 specific thing, I can also help with the wording or help get it to the right people. But other than that, it was a great discussion. The next Youngsters meeting, for those that care, will be on the 29th of March. So if there's any follow-up or questions, please feel free to join that meeting. Thank you.
All right. So continuing the chair status. With the chartered work group items, where Yang push notifications as an RFC. Congratulations to the authors. RFC 9196. The rest of the workgroup items, we have SZTP CSR draft, which is past IESG review. I believe it's in the RFC editor queue at this point. The HTTPS NOTIF draft is waiting for a write-up, and I guess is it fair to say that Shepherd has been identified? I'm asking Robbie here.
Robert, yes, I've got a Shepherd lined up, so that's good. And I need to do the write-up, so it's just waiting on me. So I will try and get to that soon, this week, hopefully.
Thanks, Rob. The client server suite of drafts have completed work group last call. There are a couple of last call issues that are being resolved as we speak. The UDP NOTIF draft is work in progress, will be discussed in this meeting. And the distributed NOTIF is at version 3, and there's been very little discussion on the list. So here is the agenda for today. We have, of course, Kent with the client server suite of drafts, and UDP NOTIF, UDP based transport for configured is the other work group chartered item. On the non-chartered item list, we have a few presentations. So it should be a fairly packed session, with enough time for questions at the end. Right? I think that's pretty much it for the chair presentations. Any questions? Okay, I don't see.
Scott's in the queue. Go ahead, Scott.
Hi, it's maybe it's just me because I am remote, but Mahesh, it sounds like he's underwater or something. I don't know if I just need to turn up my volume, but I have no trouble hearing Kent or Rob or anyone else. So just wanted to raise that. Thanks.
Okay, is this any better?
Yes, it is
Yes,
better when you face
that's
the
much
Okay.
better.
microphone.
Thanks.
All right, I'll try to speak into the mic.
Okay. Mahesh, I'm going to revoke your. Oh, you did it yourself. Fine. Let me start sharing the next set of slides. Okay, so my name's Kent. I'm presenting the client server suite of drafts. This has been a long project for the working group, and we're almost to the end of it. This is actually the first time that the client server suite of drafts has been presented since IETF113, though they were touched on as chair slides amendment or notes during the chair slides in previous IETF sessions. So on this time, I'll just do a little bit of recap. Going back to 110, it's not much actually, because we've just been doing fit and finish for the most part. But for the cryptotypes draft, we did accommodate some sector review comments from Valerie Simslov, and we added the hidden keys feature. So the hidden concept of hidden keys existed before, just the feature statement, hidden keys, didn't exist before. In the trust anchors draft, we added prefixes to the path statements on a per trust anchor issue regarding that issue. And we renamed the trust store supported feature to central trust store supported. That was from Jurgen, I believe. We removed two unnecessary / unwanted min element 1 statements and added a present statement. And we added an informative reference to the netmod with system draft. So with regards to built-in keys, at the time that we wrote the text for built-in keys and trust anchors, we only had operational data store, but now there's this introduction of a system data store, so those things could show up there as well. And so an informative reference made sense. For the key store draft, we also, the same note about adding prefixes to path statements. And again, we renamed the feature from key store supported to central key store supported. And we added feature statements for asymmetric keys and symmetric keys. And lastly, an informative reference to the with system draft. You'll notice that on the right-hand side, it does mention that the key store is the liaison we just discussed. And so next slide, we have a TCP client server draft. We removed the TCP connection grouping, and so now we just use the TCP common grouping directly. That was actually done that was back in the 110 timeframe. That was done a while ago. We added a security consideration section for the local binding supported feature. And then for SSH client server draft, we removed the supported authentication methods from the client authentication grouping. And we moved algorithms away from the IETF SSH common module to a more general IANA maintained modules. And this is kind of a big thing. We also did it in the TLS client server draft, but essentially the same update where we're going to the IANA maintained registries for algorithms once for SSH and then separately again for TLS, and converting those registries into Yang modules that can be henceforth maintained by IANA. So that's what that item there is. We also added a config false list for the algorithm supported. So while their IANA registry defines hundreds of algorithms, a particular server may only support a subset of them. So this config false list enables them to identify, the server to identify which subset they support. And we also added, to be discussed in this slide presentation, a generate public key RPC. And so we'll be discussing that in a moment. For the TLS client server draft, we again moved algorithms, and we have now the IANA maintained modules. And again, we added a config false list for the algorithms supported by the server. And then lastly, we made a major update to this draft and specifically to the Yang modules to support TLS 1.3, mostly in reaction to comments made by Tom Petch over the course of the last year with regards to how TLS 1.3 was quite different. And shortly, we'll be presenting that as well. So moving on, there were really no updates to the HTTP client server draft in these past year, just NITs. In the NetConf client server draft, we did augment in a mapping required flag into the client identity mappings only for the SSH transport. And so just locking things down, making the validation more correct. And then lastly, we removed Appendix A, which was having before fully expanded tree diagrams, but those tree diagrams were enormous. I mean, literally the tree diagram itself spanned 5 pages, I think. And so we just removed those fully, and when I say fully expanded, I mean all the groups have been expanded. So the uses statements have been expanded. So now only both the NetConf and RESTConf client server drafts have just the unexpanded where the grouping are displayed as uses. So those are the updates since 1.10. I did mention a couple items that we're going to circle back on. The first is this generate public key RPC, which is an open issue, and I'm hoping to get some discussion. So about 3 years ago, folks may remember that the crypto types draft attempted to define actions for generating private keys. And after much discussion, we abandoned these action statements when it became not possible to define a set of algorithm identifiers that spanned protocol stacks. So for instance, SSH and TLS. Each of these protocols are their own crypto silos, if you will, having their own IANA maintained registries and trying to get the security directorate or area to unify, to come up with a unified set of algorithm identifiers that span these protocols proved difficult, to say the least. So we did abandon that idea about 3 years ago. But since then, as mentioned earlier, both the SSH client server and TLS client server drafts now have their own IANA maintained algorithm identifiers that are being pulled from IANA maintained registries. And so it becomes possible again to maybe define an RPC, but this time make it be protocol specific RPCs in each draft. So I've already made this update to the SSH draft, which on the next slide I'll show. And the slide after is regarding the TLS draft, which is where the discussion comes into play. So for the SSH draft, you can see it's just an RPC. It's very straightforward. Their input, but notice that the algorithm at the very top on the right-hand side in yellow, it's an algorithm identifier identity reference. So that is a reference to, and you can see it, SSH, of course, is the protocol SSH. PKA stands for Public Key Algorithm. So in SSH, there's 4 different kinds of algorithm identities, base classes. PKA is one of the 4, and is the only one that really matters when it comes to generating private keys. So it's a reference to that public key identifier as basically what is the kind of algorithm, or what kind of key do you want to generate. There's a bit, so how long of a key, and then there's a little bit of how do you want it to be encoded. Do you want the key to be returned as clear text, or should it be encrypted by another key, or would you like, in fact, the system to hide the key, like it becomes a built-in key, not ever visible to the outside the server? And the response is effectively exactly the same as what you'd find inside KeyStore, but in the form of output for the RPC response. So the format of the key, how it's been encoded, And then, of course, if it's different kinds of key, if it's clear text, you just get the key. If it's hidden, then it's just an empty. You don't really get the key. It just says it's empty. And if it's encrypted, you get back the encrypted data, but also a reference to the other key that it was encrypted by. So that's all very straightforward and it's easy. I mean, doing this RPC took me no more than 45 minutes probably to put together. Very straightforward. Then I moved on to TLS to try to do the same there and discovered some complication. The issue is that with TLS, there's only one registry, and that registry defines what's called Cipher Suites. So these Cipher Suites are, they're not standalone private key algorithm like SSH. It's more of a combination of a private key algorithm, an encryption algorithm, blocking, padding. And so an example would be, for instance, TLS-RSA- with AES-256 CBC SHA-256. So you can just see how many different algorithms have been encoded in there. But the main thing is RSA. So this is in fact an RSA key, and if you were to ask the system to generate a key for that Cipher suite, it would be expected that the system could say, oh, what you want me to do is to generate an RSA key. Anyway, but it's a little bit, it's not perfect, right? It's not like with SSH. So the question, and again, I'm hoping for some discussion, is should we move forward? Should we continue and define this RPC, passing in a Cipher Suite algorithm, assuming that the server can identify which private key and generate the appropriate key from there? Or should we just back out of, I'm kind of adding in this generating a private key at the last hour. Again, it was removed about 3 years ago. At that time, it was author's preference, and I decided I prefer not to move forward with it. It's kind of what I was thinking at that time. But now it's so easy because the INET defined registry. So I'm willing to give it another small go if people can help me get past this one issue. Any comments on this?
Okay, I don't
Yes.
see anyone in the room.
Joe's on the queue. Go ahead, Joe.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead and.
Joe Clark, Cisco. Can you go back a couple of slides? I didn't actually have a comment here. It was just reading. Okay, one more up. So is it generating the public key or is it generating the public-private key? I just found the name of the RPC to
Yes,
be a bit
it's
confusing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's generating the private key, but in doing so, it also generates the public key. And in the key store itself, it stores both. And since this was a mimic of what is stored in the key store, then also the output contains both the public key and the private key. But
Okay,
the main thing that's coming back is the private key.
Brian, and so I was thinking, would generate key pair or something along those lines be clearer? I just think of like analogous to SSH keygen, something that
Yeah.
is unambiguous that you're actually generating both.
Oh, okay. Possibly. The actual name of this RPC, Generate Public Key, I think I stole from OpenSSH, and it mimicked their language. And remember, I mentioned that SSH has 4 different kinds of algorithm identifiers. So this is the public key algorithm identifier. It's actually called, quote, public key. So I was trying to leverage that, but you make a good point. We don't have to necessarily, we could just say generate key pair, asymmetric key pair. That would be an option. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't have a response to the other one, but this one I was scratching my head because it seemed like you were doing both. Thanks.
Okay. Anyone else? Any other comments? Our crypto experts in the room? Well, how about this? Does anyone feel like we should not pursue this? Again, it was sort of being added. Should we just close down the idea of, it's best practice for a server to generate private key.
Okay, we do have one person coming up to the mic, Diego Lopez.
Okay.
I forgot to register on the Mitico. Just I was checking that I remember in the good old days there was Cipher Suites that were allowed to have a null value for some of the. I know that they are not valid for TLS, but you could use a Cipher Suite only to identify one particular part of the suite. Is here this is the relevant part, that would be doable. I'm not sure this has been deprecated by the people in the TLS, but if the in the TLS group, but if the purpose is to identify a concrete private key, for example, I think it would be valid. Valid for the intention, not valid as a TLS acceptable cipher suite anyway.
Okay, thank you. We can confirm with the TLS chairs as well. Okay, moving forward, thank you everyone for those comments. I'm going to transition now to slides for the update to the TLS, and I have a co-presenter, Jeff Hartley, who's joining me. And Jeff, yeah, perfect. I see he's joined the microphone queue. And so, Jeff, I'm going to actually, if you'd like, I'm going to pass slide control to you, which you now have. If you hit your right, left mouse button, you should be able to increment the slides. Go
Gotcha.
ahead.
Just checking the audio there. I see the graph showing up in the interface. Just want to make sure it's audible over the session.
You sound perfect to me.
Okay. So just a quick summary. Try not to take too much time here. Some feedback had arrived via previous chatter prior to my joining the team. Think of me as an informal liaison from BBF. We have a lot of client-server type applications that we're looking at rolling out in the next year or two in some of our own standards, and having a standards-based framework for integrating those would be perfect. Things like gRPC, Kafka, HTTPS transport, things like that. So some of the chatter that had been active at the time that I threw some time over the wall here was that TLS 1.2 and TLS 1.3's usage of the term PSK are vastly different, and that proved to be the case. So in the original specifications, there, of course, was already a PSK in place, and it sort of had the assumptions of TLS 1.2 and going before that. So it was quickly deemed necessary to split that out, designate which one was 1.2, which one was 1.3. In fact, this notion of an external PSK is prevalent throughout the TLS 1.3 RFC. So in fact, I would dare say it's not really a TLS v1.3 PSK, it's a TLS v1.3 ePSK. One noteworthy change is this notion of zero round trip time, as they call it. And it's that the entire handshake, once the client has authenticated itself and the server's accepted that, and they effectively agree upon the parameters embedded in the external PSK, they can immediately start sending data. The server can immediately start fulfilling requests. And while that's a gross oversimplification of the full description, which you can of course find in 1.3, it really did need some attention and call out here. So the action items as described, just split 1.2 and 1.3 PSKs apart from each other. A few additional identities and features, of course, so we could use if feature statements to apply some constraints to them, but nothing too earth-shattering beyond that. Hopefully the font is legible, but I kept only sort of the main body. You can see the full text of these drafts via Kent's GitHub and that sort of thing. So all the descriptions and references, I assure you, are there. In fact, a couple of the notes are pretty handy reading, I would say. So in the case of the TLS 1.2 PSK, that was the original structure. It really is unchanged. It's just renamed the original PSK there, and you'll notice that you're going to see the concept of identity hints and things like that, which don't exist in 1.3. When we get into the 1.3 ePSK, right, and again, those of us who are sticklers for syntax will notice that the ePSK is different than the -PSK above it. I assure you that's consistent with the RFCs, and it helps really point out the difference, that there's no parity between these things and how they're used. The actual cryptography underneath it was really not the big challenge here. In other words, we could still reuse this notion of key store as Kent and Company's drafts had already defined it. So that part wasn't so bad. But you're going to notice that there's some leaves in here that are dissimilar to what had come before. Of course, the The actual hash itself, you can see right there, there's a new type for that, like what hash algorithm you're going to use. There's a limit of exactly 2 that are currently defined. That being an identity could be extended pretty easily in the future should TLS 1.3 add additional types of hashes supported. And a lot of this is sort of context specific. There's the actual leaf for context, target protocol. For example, if you had, say, an HTTPS client, right, or if you had some other form of client that is effectively manipulating this, then that information can be populated. And the key derivation function is another mandatory piece in here. Again, the descriptive text had to be trimmed to fit on the slides, but this is the structure of what was added and differentiated from the TLS 1.2 and prior PSKs. The server, of course, when we're looking at the client, the server is the inverse of the clients, and it simply specifies, hey, which of these if features are you going to support when you're talking to a particular server? If you look at the server, it's, of course, the inverse of the client. The exact same structures, right, with opposite positioning. So the TLS server grouping contains the case statements that we were just speaking of, and the container specifying what client authentication it will support in terms of PSKs is there. And I believe, Kent, did I have the? I did include the additional identities here. There was a bit of a nomenclature cleanup there. We went for the most simplistic structure of just TLS 1.2, TLS 1.3. That got cleaned up throughout the files. And we talked about the new type def for EPSK supported hashes that's easily extensible. I had said identity earlier, but type def for that. And that's about it. The references, it's really the same 3 references in most of the fields we talked about there. And you can see those listed here. I'll pause here and see if folks want to line up with any questions. There might be a couple of folks on the chat or in the room whose previous comments were directly addressed by this, or at least I hope were directly addressed by this.
I do not see Tom Petch on Meet Echo, so if we're waiting for him to respond, I don't think we're going to get that.
Okay, well then I'll end my section by just stating that if folks do have time to look at these later and they'd like to make comments, I do participate in the NetConf mailer. So thanks.
Oh, uh-oh, I think I killed slides. Sorry about that. Oh, hold on. No. We're not supposed to be sharing these slides just yet. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Zooming ahead to the end. Thank you, Jeff. And by the way, Jeff was just absolutely awesome. We worked together, I think, over the course of maybe 3 months and possibly meeting every other week on all of this. So it was really huge contribution. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, last slide for me. Next steps. We mentioned, so Jeff just talked about updates to the TLS. We should definitely be validating the correctness of these updates. Significant security, related update. It would be good for sector to take a look at it. I do know that sector takes a look at all drafts as they're being published, so perhaps we do it just as a part of the normal IETF publication process, or if Rob AD would like to have a proactive, sector review beforehand. Before doing that, we could discuss that as well. As mentioned also, there's the IEEE liaison. Some minor updates need to be made there. And lastly, resolving the generate key RPC action issue that we just discussed. And then we're done. I mean, amazingly, working group chairs can publish the entire set to AD at this point in just a few weeks. And I'll be noting here, we started this work in 2014, so 8 years ago. This has been a large, long effort. and happy to be near the end. And that's it for this presentation. Thank you. Oh, I do see Rob in the queue. Go ahead, Rob. While I queue up the next thing.
So just Rob Wilson, Cisco. I was just going to ask, in terms of an early SecDR review, have you been working quite closely with the security folks anyway? I understand. So I think you're probably good to do that just as part of the general reviews. I'm not sure we need an early review here, unless you think otherwise.
I don't actually think otherwise. I think it'd be okay to push it, do it as part of the normal process.
So I think that's what I would suggest.
What I would do, Rob, is in your write-up, just bring note to it, so some extra attention is brought to that section. I think it's reasonable to just have people take an extra careful look at the way the TLS 1.3 is supported.
Yep, happy to flag that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and now we're moving to the next presentation. This is UDP-based transport for configured subscriptions. Yes, thank you, Alex. Please go ahead. Oh, let me pass you control of the slides as well, if I can. I'm not able to, so just tell me when you want to see next slide. Oh, here it is. I can do it. Sorry about that. Okay, you can increment your own slides now. Hit right button, left button.
Yes, it's working. Yes, thank you. So this is Alex Wang from Insalion, and I am presenting today the few changes we did on the dash 05 of UTP notif draft. On the agenda, I will explain shortly the diff we made on this new draft, and we would like to start a discussion on how to configure DTLS from the Young module, which we got a little feedback on the mailing list. So the few changes during the last IETF, we got feedback from Rob, I think, that we should specify the RFCs of the encoding types of JSON and CBOR, because they had multiple RFCs. We at the end decided that instead of just specifying the RFC, we could just referencing the media types instead. So the registry would reference directly to the already standardized of the YANA media types. After that, we modified a little the Young model, the Young module. We added a feature encode CBOR leaf in the Young module, and then also change all the encoding type references to be aligned with the whole draft. We also have been talking with the chairs for the DTLS encryption part of this draft. We got feedback that it should make it good for the security review, having the DTLS part in this draft. And then lastly, some days ago, I would say that we got some feedback that if we would add the DTLS part in the Young module to be configurable from the router directly. So we would like to start actually a discussion on this meeting that if it is something that it is expected from the community, I would guess yes. And then if just importing we saw that in the draft NetConf TLS client server, there are some Young modules implemented, and if just importing them, it would be enough. But starting the discussion on this meeting. And would say that would be all. Just a quick presentation too about the distributed notif draft. We changed a little, so we did some minor changes on the Young model, and we also think that the draft is already pretty stable, and that we would like to last call when this UDP notice draft is last called. So that would be from my part, and we could start this discussion. So Kent.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So yes, it is a good idea to modify the configuration model so that the actual TLS part of DTLS can be configured. I mean, so we're asking the server to, in some cases, initiate the outbound TLS connection to a remote TLS server, and how does it authenticate that server certificate? Does it need to authenticate itself to the server? Where is the configuration for these things specified? It is necessary. It cannot, I don't believe, be just a flag like DTLS is on. There's a configuration that has to be specified, and I think that's the request. So yes, exactly. What it would come down to is the Yang module that is in this draft would import the TLS client module, and maybe also the TLS server module if it turns out that it needs to actually listen to connections as well. And then that should be most of it. You would want to also add examples that illustrate those configurations being set. And I think that's the ask. Does it make sense?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So I had similar comments as Kent for the UDP notif, but also for the distributed notif. We'd love to see some examples of the configuration aspect. I know there are some examples of subscribe notifications, but the actual configuration part examples I didn't, at least the last version, I didn't think I saw anything in particular. So that would be nice to have. And then, in summary, would you say that the distributed notif draft is really about having this ID that identifies the node from where the notifications are coming from? Because that's pretty much the summary of that, what I understood of the draft.
Sorry, can you repeat the last question? I did not get.
So with the what I remember seeing the last version of the draft, essentially what you're trying to do is put in, I don't remember the name you gave to it, but it's a node ID that identifies where the notification is coming from. Is that correct?
Yes, the subscription ID.
Yeah, maybe it's the subscription ID. So is that the summary of really that whole draft? That you're essentially providing a subscription ID?
Maybe Thomas or Pierre could answer that.
Maybe I answer the question. It's the main subscription ID, which is the identifying process of processors.
Okay, Thomas, you're kind of breaking up on, at least at our end.
Okay, is it now better?
Yes.
Okay. Domain subscription ID is basically the identifier which identifies the export process on the router if more than one process is there. And this is needed for the segmentation. So,
Okay.
so in a nutshell, that's what distributed notif is. And since it's transport agnostic, we need to describe that in a separate draft.
Okay. So the comment on it being transport independent, would you still say that you don't want to talk about whether the underlying whether the transport is TCP based or UDP based, or you give particular examples for each type of transport that you're going to use?
Which is basically where we can implement that. It is not implemented in the HTTPS notice, but for future drafts, that's why it is set. And this concept is not something which is coming from NetConf. This is actually also being applied the same way in IETF.
Okay, I'll send you the comments on the mailing list
Sure.
because we are having some problems at our end.
Should we move on to the next presentation now?
Yeah.
Okay. And Mahesh, why don't you, or just, I mean, let people, okay, there's a small agenda bashing while we were between slides here, and we've moved the adaptive subscription presentation to the end. Everything else will be the same. So next is per node capabilities for optimal data collection. I think Benoit is in the room. Will be presenting.
Yes, I am.
Perfect.
So let me present this. So as you introduced this is like the per node capabilities for Optimum operational data collection. So that's a draft that started about 2 years ago. And the goal today is to see if there is still interest to continue on this draft. So disclaimer, I have not updated it, just a refresh. So if you go to the next slide, there is just, if we're looking at automation, we know that in the end, automation is as good as your data models. So we created many models in the IETF and in different places in the industry. So we're on the right track over there. So your automation is as good as your tool chain. And we worked on the tool chain in hackathon in different places. Is it perfect? No, but it's getting there. Your automation is as good as your Yang models metadata. And we work on the Yang catalog where we've got metadata about those Yang models. It is a standard, it is implemented, it is a service model, all this. The last point is the per node capabilities. Because if you want to configure something in your network, you want to know if a specific node that you want to configure, let's say for telemetry, has some capabilities. Now, if you go to the next slide, this is what we did with this new RFC 9196 that Mahesh presented in the intro. What we have in there is 2 Yang models. The first one is a placeholder, and the second one offers some capabilities. So if I look at the last 4 entries on the slides, it tells us per nodes what is the minimum update period that you could have on telemetry, right, for a specific object. It tells us what are the supported update period, whether on-change is supported, right? Let's say you want to do telemetry with on-change. It's key to understand if that specific node supports it or not. And the minimum dampening period. So we produced that RFC, and that's also a reason why we have not updated our draft, because it's linked. So if you go to the next slide now. So this draft is about updating this list of Yang objects, so per node. And we provide 2 RPC just to be able to retrieve them easily, to see if those nodes that we're looking for are capable of doing what we want. Okay? As I mentioned, the draft has not been updated, but now that we've got the previous RFC, it's time to decide what we want to do. So let's go over the couple of examples. So next slide, please. So the first one is like the suggested observable period, right? It's like, yeah, maybe the router supports all these different periods for observation. But maybe there is one which is the one that the vendor suggests, right? And it's different at the minimum one, because maybe the minimum one is like 1 millisecond, but maybe it's not very practical, or the router will have some problem to sustain it. The second one is that, well, if let's say I want to stream the FIP content, we could say the minimum one is 1 millisecond or 1 second, but actually it depends how big your FIP is, right? So just giving something like a generic answer is not always practical. So telling like the router under these conditions, knowing the number of entries in the FIP, as one example, we advise you to stream it every 5 minutes or whatever. But the point is that these are capabilities that are depending on a node per node basis. Next slide, please. The next one is the optimized measurement point. So typically, in a router, let's say you want to stream a specific interface counter, number of packets, right? Now, internally in a router, you might have a structure with all the interface counters. So going and taking a single entry in that structure to stream it might be less efficient than just streaming the entire structure. From a router point of view, not bandwidth, right? But then on the corrector side, you could just be filtering out what you don't care about. So in this example of the interface, number of packet interface, maybe this value will tell you, well, just observe the entire tree, which is interface, right? So this is the idea behind that one. On the next slide. This one is about the corresponding Yang object and MIP OID, if we know it, right? So we know SNMP still works, right? We know it's not going to be replaced. So sometimes just knowing that a specific Yang object refer to an OID is interesting. Now you could say, I'm going to do it offline. And I tried. Now here's the thing. If we take interface that we all know, it seems like very simple, but interface in SNMP, we know this. Admin status, upper status. If we come to Yang, it depends, because we could have like the interface Yang module, which is pre-NMDA, with 2 different containers. No, 1 container. We could have the Yang module NMDA, which is 1 container, but different data stores. We could have the open config, which is yet a different one. We could have like a proprietary one. So there is not a single mapping, but from the router point of view, if you know you support 1 or 2, then you just give the mapping for those, right? On the next slide. It's something similar to the admin status and upper status, right? How do you know that in SNMP, one is the intended and one is the applied? Because you know it, right? In Yang, we try to solve that one. by adding different data stores. But in case you have like non-open config or non-NMDA, you don't know that. So there are things you could be telling that this one relates to that one. This is the ID between the rated nodes over there. So these are, and I believe this is the last one I want to show you, these are examples of the things we were thinking about at the same time that the RFC 9196 was done. And initially in there was one that was unchanged, yes or no, but it was moved into the other draft. Now the question is, and if you go to the next slide, please. Oh, by the way, there is also 2 RPCs to directly get the information from the router before you configure them. Okay. And on the next slides, I'll skip the open issues because they are not so important for now, but I want to go to the last slide, which is, okay, what do we do now? We have this brand new RFC 9196. It does its job, right? But do we have a need? Do we still have a need for the new object I mentioned here? If the answer is no, because it's, or not now, that's fine. If there are some use cases, well, we work again on those. This is the status where I'm right now with the co-authors. So the floor is yours for feedback.
So we could try to do a show of hands if that's what you're interested to find out, if there's interest.
Feedback of show of hands, or
There's a
interest,
couple in the
whatever
queue.
you.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a couple in the queue. Yeah. Maybe, Tim, you want to go first?
Hello?
Yep, hear you.
Good. So I will say, Benoit, that we have seen in the past similar problems that you're talking about with like the MIBO ID, but actually for other protocols as well, like for IPFix, for example, the IE number there that would be assigned to the node. So we do see some usefulness for those features to be able to have the source correlate it back with other identifiers for other protocols. But when you do that, if we could somehow make that kind of a list and allow for the identities to be done for one or more types of things. You can do IPFix or SNMP or both, right? Where you're given a NOID or the IPFix number for whatever purposes that the system needs.
Very good, thank you, Tim. For the IPFix, it's slightly more complex because there is semantic behind it, depending on your key field definitions. So there is not always a one-to-one mapping. I could go into more details later. It's slightly more complex for flows than for
but it's for
IDs.
the same problem, right? That you're
Exactly.
trying to do in it. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So I think if we can address that, I know that there's needs in the market for that.
Very good, thank you.
So before Rob comes on, there is a poll out there right now for you to vote on. The answer is, if you raise hand, you're showing interest in the work. If you're not raising your hand, you have either no interest or have no comment. Oh, on the online tool, is there an ability on the phone? Yes, I believe there is. Okay, go ahead, Rob.
Share mics. Thanks very much. It's very interesting. So I had one comment on the idea of sort of a recommended polling interval rather than a minimum. I definitely think that makes sense in the context that, as you say, a minimum polling interval doesn't always makes sense depending on capacity and things. One of the things that, even with a recommended one, is it might depend on what other subscriptions you've got at the same time. So if you've only got a subscription against the variable or the fib, then that might give you one interval, whereas if you're pulling off a lot of other data at the same time, then that will change. And I think that's one aspect that's also related to the adaptive telemetry drafts, the same issues. How do you advertise not just what you can do at the extreme, but what you can do in a sort of more generalized sense? I think that's an interesting problem. I don't know whether the recommended one, because that would change dynamically, is what you want, or whether you need something to be able to say, these are all the subscriptions I'm interested in, tell me what you can do here. And it's interesting that what GNMI does here is they have an option of saying, just do the best. So it's just whatever the server can provide. But again, if more subscriptions come along, does that interval then change over time? And how does the client adjust to that or not? So I think there's some interesting stuff. Your other question is, are you interested in this now? I've not actually put my hand up either ways. I don't know. There's some interesting aspects here. Whether we would implement this at this time, I'm not sure. But down the line, I think so.
Thank you, Rob. Good feedback. So somehow whenever you mention do your best, this is what we want to do, right? Because the router is left to route packets from time to time. So do your best is what we want. Now we want to slightly formalize this, because if at an example of flows, IPFix, you do sampling, great. You're able to get your sampling rate back to your flow collector so that you could do your own computation. Now, in this world of adaptive, where you do your best, if you don't know what the best is, and it keeps changing, if you don't advertise this to your data collection system, then you cannot reconcile information easily. If you speak about some delay, that's fine, because you could kind of average that. If we speak about multiplying counters because you are doing some sort of sampling, then we have a problem. But this is the idea. Do your best based on what you could do now. And send me the information, by the way, because I need to get the context that will follow the data. All right.
Charles is next in queue.
So, yeah, this is Charles, but I'm channeling a question from Jürgen because we weren't able to confirm with him about asking it. But he just asked, does the nodes tag work in netmod provide the means to obtain the metadata? Do we really need a new RPC?
Short answer, I don't know yet.
You want to take the mic too?
Jürgen, short answer, I don't know yet. I'll look into that.
All right. Thank you, Charles. And Joe's in the queue next. You have a question, Joe?
Joe Clark, Cisco. Not a question, comment. So I think I raised my virtual hand. I think it's interesting. I'm kind of curious, and I can leave more details on email. Like some of that, like the what Rob said about the polling, yes. The SNMP OID, I mean, you and I know, useful, but there's a lot of challenges there. Like just knowing the OID alone doesn't really help me. I need to have the index mapping, and that's on a per instance. I just wonder if there's, it sounds useful. Is it going to be doable enough to actually make, to spend the time to do the work? I guess that's what I'm getting at. This kind of Rosetta Stone would be amazing. Tim brought up another, I just don't know how practical it would all be.
Very good point, Joe. Actually, I tend to agree with you, because it's whenever we'll go into details of getting an index in a MIP, or actually multiple indices, and then we've got like a Yang, which has different indices, and it's going to be complex. So this one was put in there because we ideally want to solve that. Will we arrive? I'm not sure. So maybe if we have to do things in step, might be the right answer.
Raise my hand and go to the queue at the same time, and it's not well. Yeah, it's simply that I mean, this is the kind of feature that we have been demanding quite often. talking among us, precisely because it would be really helpful in precisely warranting, well, I would not say comfortable, but reasonable path for migration and for integrating different elements that instead of using what we are using right now, that is the best guess or whatever we get from experience or from interaction with the manufacturers. This is quite useful in the sense that you can integrate this in a whole life cycle of what you're doing. So you have my hand was raised for a long time, so I just
so they were like. Go ahead, take the mic.
Sorry, so because I want to clarify, so there is like MIP OID, there is like proposed observation collection period, etc. So is there risk and for everything, or you have things that you need now and we could do some later?
in principle, if you're asking me, well, it's the letter to Santa Claus for everything. Come on, that's no. Seriously, no. If we had to experiment with something, personally, I found, I mean, from my experience, not the purely operational, in which people for MIB and OID would be probably more interested. The one about the related node is something that interests me personally more. But I would say that the migration path probably would be the most interesting for the real, the people that are running the real networks.
Thank you.
We do have one more question, but just to let everyone know, I ended the poll, and we had 29 participants with 24 saying they had some interest. And we have Balaz in the queue. Go ahead, Balaz.
Actually, just quickly, before Balaj starts speaking, that was Diego Lopez who was at the mic just last time. He didn't introduce himself. So, yeah. Go ahead, Balaj.
Balaz, make sure you unmute your mic.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So besides OIDs and IP-fixed references, we also deal with 3GPP management systems using distinguished names. So that could be another reference that would be very good to map to Yang sometimes. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Balaj.
All right. For those who did comment, go ahead to the notes page and do add your comments for Benoit, please.
All right. Next presentation will be the transaction ID, Jan Lindblad. Let me get the slides queued up. And Jan, I'm going to make you the controller, so left, right mouse button should do it for you. Go ahead.
Thank you. So this is update what's going on with the transaction ID that some of you may have followed earlier. So I wanted to go do a quick problem and solution recap, and then talk about the simulated results that we have since earlier, and then mention a few words about what's in the works right now. So this work is trying to address three problems. One is the get config. It's a slow and costly operation. And if you want to use it for change detection on the server, if your client wants to know if the server has changed, this is an expensive way to do that. So you do get config and you get a response, and then you do a get config later and get a response, see if it looks the same. But it's consuming both CPU on both sides and a lot of network bandwidth to find out that nothing happened. The second problem is with Yang push. So if a client is subscribing to updates on some parts of the server configuration, and then getting updates after that when something happens in the server, that's of course great. But what happens is that if the client is configuring the server, he will get updates about his own change as well, and it kind of unnecessary, and it takes a lot of computations to figure out, oh, actually this I already knew this because I said it. So if there was a way to identify those updates as being, well, what you already know, that would be good. And the third thing, well, actually more than CPU consumption and network bandwidth consumption, a problem is that's important for many cases is that we want to detect when multiple clients are making changes at the same time and to the same server, so that if they are clobbering each other, they would want to know. And the current method of using getConfig is both costly and it has a hole, right? You can do a getConfig, but before you are able to send the edit config that follows to make your change, there's a window of vulnerability. If somebody else is doing an edit config in that window, you would still be clobbering. You can, of course, take the lock, but since getConfig can take several minutes, you don't want to take locks that are so prolonged. So a lot of people have talked about, yeah, let's introduce a sort of simplistic top-level transaction ID where every server keeps track of, for example, the timestamp when it was last changed, or some sort of global number at the top that reflects the contents. So that in getConfig, you can ask, well, what's your transaction ID? And when you get the content for getConfig, you also get that number, like 4711. Many servers have implemented this already, but not in a standard way, but in each vendor in a proprietary way. And then that could reduce the amount of traffic in CPU considerably for some use cases. But what we have found is that many of the use cases that are interesting are not like that. You would actually have more applications, more clients that are interested in certain subparts of the configuration of servers. Let's say we have a VPN client, a security client, and an underlay client that care mostly about different parts of the config of the server. And if all you get is this top-level ETAG number 471 there, and it changes, these clients, they don't know if something that affects them or they care about has changed or not. And in many cases, that ETAG number is changing so frequently because of changes that are going on this device that there's no point in trying to track that at all. So we have found that many of our customers are turning off that feature, even for the devices that support this top-level thing. So that's why we think a transaction ID or ETAG mechanism that goes deeper into the tree is very valuable, so that you can synchronize the parts of the configuration or track changes to the part of the configuration that you actually care about. And the draft is also talking about the edit config mechanism that is lock-free and detects clobbering without any sort of vulnerability windows. So this is something that you might have already known because we talked about it before. It's nothing new here, but just to remind you what we are talking about here. In order to measure what this draft would give you, we did a measurement on a real-world application that was running in one of our labs for an hour. And this application was then doing a lot of management of devices in the network. And it was doing 569 round trips. That means get configs and edit configs and all sorts of messages that it was sending to the server. And it was sending about 1 megabyte of netconf traffic during that time. But if we implemented the sort of mechanism that we talk about in this draft, those 569 would go down to 378 round trips. So about 1/3 would be gone. And that, of course, removes both network load and delay in applications because round trips take a lot of time. And reducing the amount of traffic from 1 megabyte to just a little more than a half megabyte, which again reduces network load and processing time on both sides. And this is now then a mechanism that doesn't require any sort of locking, and it removes this window of vulnerability. So if you think this is interesting, we can continue working on this together to look at how we implement things, and there are a few open questions in this work. The thing that we are looking at right now is to add text for how Yang push should integrate into this. It's something that is not mentioned in the current -01 version at all. And we are looking at in-house doing prototype implementations of this just to verify this with a broader class of use cases than this simulation that we did. That's all I had to say. Any comments or questions?
Jan, did you want a poll to see if there was interest in the work?
That could be a good idea, yeah. If we can arrange that, please.
Mahesh, before the poll, maybe some questions. At least I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead
Jan,
while I set up the poll.
okay, great. Jan, so I'm highly supportive of this work, but first, can you just clarify? You didn't use the word RESTConf in your presentation, but this, by and large, in my mind, is enabling NetConf to have feature parity with RESTConf, at least in terms of the E-tag and maybe also the modification time on a, within the tree, deep in the tree. Is that a fair characterization? It's effectively enabling NetConf to have feature parity to RESTConf in that regard?
Yes, and if you read the draft, you will actually see RESTConf mentioned in there and exactly how it would work. And it is, I would definitely say it's feature parity, but it also goes beyond that.
Yes.
And that's going beyond is also applicable to RESTConf.
Okay. And then my second question is on your first bullet point on this slide, you talk about integration to Yang push. It doesn't even occur to me. Can you just say a few words more about what is the nature of that integration that might be needed?
Yeah, I mean, we have this, let's see, I can actually go back here in the slides. I have this poll in front of me, so I can't really see the slide very well. But okay, so when you subscribe to configuration updates using Yang push for part of the tree that you're interested in, whatever the client itself is pushing to that part of the tree will be echoed back to him. But it's difficult to understand if this is another update from some other transaction that happened on this server, or if it is my own thing.
I see.
Since there's no way of knowing, you have to actually parse this whole thing and see, yeah, actually it matches exactly what I already had, so then I can throw it away.
Yeah, and this may be an echo of your problem number one. I forget if it was or not, but you mentioned the server getting back a notification for something that it had already, it knows it did it, so why would it need to get a notification for it? And as you were saying that, I was thinking to myself that maybe it's not so bad. I mean, if the bandwidth and processing isn't huge, it's still probably valuable to have a record of the thing having occurred. And so in that regard, I probably would say it's not a big deal. So if it's the same issue, then maybe it's not a big deal.
I think that actually, if you look into how we could do this with the transaction ID, you could do exactly that, but much more efficient than getting the full data back and having to process it and compare and all that. So getting the update is great, but if you have the Yang push mechanisms integrated with transaction IDs, you could do that.
Okay,
faster,
thank you. And again, this is Kent as a contributor. Thank you. That's it for me.
Okay.
I think those numbers are quite impressive.
Yes. So.
Oh, I see them now. Okay.
So we had 23 who participated, and 22 said they would see the work interesting.
Very good. So I think we can move into an adoption call shortly.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
We have none in the queue.
Thank you.
Changing the order just a little bit. So next is going to be Xiaoming. As I understand it, this draft actually presents the use cases for the adaptive subscription presentation, which is after this one. Is Xiaomin here? Who's presenting this?
Should be Xiaoming. Okay, I don't see. So, Mark Ifang, do you think you could present on behalf of Xiaoming?
I think I can't represent him to present this work. So very sorry about that.
Sorry, was
I'm
that a
sorry.
yes?
Yeah, Shifeng, I didn't get that. Was that a yes or a no?
No, sorry, I can't really represent him.
Okay, it's fine.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, well then I guess we'll just skip this presentation if no one's here to present it. So we will kill these slides. I shouldn't use that word, but bring up the next slides, adaptive subscription.
Yeah, I think I can drive the slide.
Okay, I'll pass control to you as soon
Okay,
as they
thank
come
you.
up. Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Thanks. So, okay, on behalf of the authors and contributors, I would like to give a presentation about the adaptive subscription to Young notification. For people who are not familiar with this work, usually a high frequency data collection leads to more resource consumption, while low frequency data collection is insufficient for photo localization, and people sometimes may find it hard to balance the need between expensive data management cost and data fidelity for troubleshooting. So this is exactly what we want to do, and our main idea is to install the adaptive subscription policy, which is built on top of Young push mechanism and allow the servers to switch to different update intervals based on the network condition changes. So about the document status, this work was first proposed about 2 years ago, and we have received a lot of comments over the past 2 years. About 2 months ago, the working group adoption call was initiated, and we have received different opinions. I think we got a lot of support and also received concerns and objections from Andy and Paul. And some of the objections are about the problem statement, while others is about the evaluation of the XPath expression, like the usage of the watermark, evaluation of XPath external evaluation, etc. So the authors investigate these concerns very carefully and update the draft accordingly, which includes the following changes, like we have defined new RPC areas. In last IETF meeting, I think it's Rob. Rob has suggested us to define a new RPC error to report when a server cannot pass the XPath syntax defined in the XPath evaluation expression, which is more complicated than it can handle. And Andy asked us what if multiple XPath criteria conflict. So we have defined 3 RPC errors so far to show adaptive subscription unsupported, and XPath syntax defined in the XPath external evaluation unsupported, and the multiple XPath criteria conflict respectively. And we admit that the watermark leaf defined in the module is confusing, so we have removed this parameter. And there are also some other questions asked by Andy, like how to evaluate the XPath expression, how to compare a targeted data object in a specific list entry, how often does the server check if the period should change. Clarifications in the updated draft has been made, and I will also explain some of the later in my slide. And another progress we have made is that we have proposed a hackathon project in this IETF meeting to provide some implementation results. We monitor the KPI changes at different frequencies of data collection and also evaluated the performance of adaptive subscription. So I will introduce the hackathon project briefly and then clarify the open issues. So this is about our hackathon text environment setup. We use the gRPC-based telemetry to collect data from different access points, the network devices in our campus, and we have evaluated the following different data collection methods: a high-frequency periodic telemetry, a low-frequency periodic telemetry, and an adaptive frequency telemetry. And for each data collection method, two cases are evaluated. One is to report the RSSI values so as to detect the real-time Wi-Fi roaming events across different APs, and the other is to stream the bytes sent from the AP uplink so as to detect the potential congestion. And we also use the ELK to collect, analyze, filter, and visualize the data. So in this case, we try to we have collected and aggregated the RSSI signal data from different APs, and usually the RSSI is a measurement of how well the terminal devices can receive a signal from an AP or a router. So usually the default roaming RSSI threshold is the -65, and if the actual signal stress is less than the threshold, then the terminal devices will search another AP to attempt roaming. So in this case, we try to figure out when a Wi-Fi roaming event happens during the movement of the terminal devices, and also try to identify continuous signal degeneration. So we tried different methods to collect the same metric, and the results show that a very high frequency data collection at a 2-second interval is easy to identify when a roaming event happens, and signal degeneration, but it also at the cost of a greater volume of data. And unsurprisingly, a low frequency collection at 13-second interval can greatly reduce the data volume, but it's hard to detect the important events and data. And we also tried adaptive subscription, which is on the right side of the slide. If the RSSI value is less than the -65, we set the period to be every 2 seconds. Otherwise, switch to 13 seconds at the interval. So since the condition can also be evaluated at the subscriber side, the subscriber evaluated the received RSSI value and made the decision whether it needs to modify the period. So while our proposal is to configure the adaptive policy into the server and allow the server to switch to different intervals automatically, so we have compared these two different ways. And the results show that for the first way, for the condition evaluated by the subscriber, the low frequency at a 30-second interval data collection prevents the subscriber from capturing roaming events, which last only 2 to 4 seconds, because the subscriber can only use the data collected every 13 seconds as the input of the condition evaluation, and it will realize to increase the frequency only when it happens to receive or RSSI value, which is less than the threshold. But for the second adaptive way, the server will evaluate the condition at the end of each high frequency interval, which is 2 seconds in this case. So it will check whether it needs to switch to another frequency every 2 seconds, even it's during the low frequency streaming now. So there is no important events and the data will be missed in our proposed way. Another case we have tried is to stream the bytes sent from the AP uplink so as to detect the possible uplink congestion. And similarly, adaptive frequency data collection is able to capture as many traffic bursts as possible. While when the monitored operational data is normal, the frequency can also be decreased. The, the line chart at the bottom right side of the slide, we can see that the adaptive subscription can greatly reduce the amount of transmitted data compared with high frequency data collection. So this is about the hackathon projects. And regarding the issues clarification, I think that the very first one is that Yangpush supports the adaptive subscription already. Yes, I think it's true. It's true that the subscriber can monitor the targeted data object change and modify the period for an existing subscription. But we think that it takes time and resources for the subscriber to to analyze the network status and send the modification request. And it also takes time and resources for the server to receive the modification and react to it. And sending modification requests to switch to from the low frequency to high frequency streaming cannot capture all important events and data due to the low frequency data collection interval. As I showed in the RSSI signal use case, which when it is low frequency data collection, the subscriber can only use the data collected every 30 seconds as the basis input for the condition evaluation. And such a time interval is very likely to cause the loss of important data. And also the third point is that when tens of thousands network devices need to be managed, the frequent modifications are prone to errors. Then people may ask about how about the proposed server-driven method? How often does the server check if the period should change? Um, I think it sounds more like an implementation decision because the more frequent condition evaluations are performed, the faster the server can react to the network condition changes. But uh, it's recommended to be at the end of each high frequency streaming update period, and which means that the data is reported at a high frequency only when the network suffers, but the server should periodically detect the condition change at this high frequency, even it's reporting data to the collector in a low frequency currently. And this to reduce the frequency of the evaluation, the server can also choose to check the targeted object change at every multiple update periods. So that's also fine, I think. Okay, then it's about and another issue is about the expat instance information. Yes, we think that the question how to select no more than one entry if there are listed instances to handle. Um, we think that XPath itself can be used to identify a particular instance. And it's true that there may be a desire to select an object inside a list. But the XPath itself is supposed to identify a particular instance inside a list already, which is defined as abbreviated syntax in XPath 1.0 W3C specification. So we don't really think this is a problem. And the last issue is still about the XPath compatibility. The problem statement seems to be limited to absolute values of specific leaf or leaf list, and usually at least a rate is needed. Uh, well, in maybe in IETF 111, I can't really remember it, but maybe there used to be a concern about arbitrary XPath complexity. So we think in order to reduce the complexity, we have recommended the implementers to use the comparison of the specific data object value and the threshold. But for the server with more powerful capabilities to handle a complex XPath syntax, we think that it's okay to use the mathematical operations in the expression. So So I think the Expat syntax supports it to use a ret. We did not really limit that capability, but our current focus on the smart filter cases, which means like the monitored data object exceeds a specific threshold. It, this is the recommended way, but we do not really limit that capability. Okay, so any comments and questions about this? Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Rob Wilson's Cisco, speak as a contributor, and I should have said that when I was responding to you, Benoit, as well, speak as a contributor. So I still have concerns about the sort of complexity that we're pushing onto the devices to do this sort of continuous monitoring and the XPath evaluation. It just feels to me like it's a very computationally expensive solution to this problem. So I think one of the things that I'd be interested in, and maybe the other presentation on the sort of use cases, if that's related to this, might be interesting, is how many cases do we actually have of solving this generically? Are there a few point cases that we're trying to solve? And would it be better to build solutions and concrete data models to solve those particular cases rather than building a generic infrastructure here? So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know exactly what you were monitoring there in terms of your sites, but could you build a data model that does that sampling at a high rate and build up either aggregated statistics or something with a decay, and then you can monitor that at high frequency and leave it at the server to respond? So I still have questions as to what data you're trying to capture. Do you actually need all this data at a high rate, or are you just trying to pick out when these particular events are occurring more generally, and hence if you had a summarized value in the data model, that might give you the same solution with far less complexity? That's my comments.
Okay, well, for your first question, I think I have the slide to. Yeah, for the adaptive subscription, the condition can evaluate it at the subscriber side and also at the server side. And if we want to leave the complexity with the subscriber, then it's maybe we have some issues to collect the enough data to identify the important events and data. And for the second way, the adaptive subscription evaluated the condition at the server side, we can collect enough data. But yes, we did add some complexity to the server. We don't really have a performance statistics about the network devices load to implement this adaptive subscription, but the results show that it seems okay because the server only add some if-then logical programming codes on the adaptive subscription, and they don't really have so much load than we expected. And also about the stream data, in this case, the evaluation data is the RSSI signal data, which is defined as a leaf data node in our exam module in the draft appendix section. So the RSSI is the stream data and is also the evaluated data. So this is the filtered about this. And I think that for adaptive subscription, the RSSI signal data streaming to identify the terminal devices roaming events maybe is the most solid use case for this draft. And I also know that there's another draft for a dedicated discussion about the use case and the problem statement about adaptive subscription, but we can see that I think that it seems more like to focus on the data collection, the traffic data collection, but our focus is about the YARN push mechanism, which is to stream data from a particular YARN data store. So, but we can see that whether the use cases draft can fit in some use cases in this one. We can see that.
So just two concrete examples I could think of is for like interface statistics. Often, I don't know if the IETF YAML has this. I don't think it does, but other ones, other vendors have this. Is you have like a rate calculation that's telling you what the current load is on that interface, and that decays over time. So it's giving you sort of a point load value, and you could potentially sample that at reasonable frequency. And another case I can think of is to do with like interface flaps. If you monitor the link layer flaps at the very low hardware layers, you may be getting thousands of interrupts per second coming through, but you don't want to notify all of those. Instead, you could notify a counter of how many flaps have occurred at each point in time. So you can still spot when these flaps are occurring, and you can still spot if they're occurring at high frequency or not, but you don't necessarily have to notify every single flap that occurs. So you're reducing the amount of data that you're pushing off the device.
Okay, thank you. I will look into that and try to give some more implementation results about their mentioned use cases.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, if there are no other comments, certainly there is interest in the use case draft. I think we would have really liked to hear that today, but considering the author is not here to talk about it, one other way that we
Actually,
feel...
Mahesh,
Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry,
Ken.
Mahesh. I did receive a private chat message from Xinwu, who says that the presenter Xiaomin will be presenting or joining shortly to present. Imminently, I'm hoping. So this may still happen.
So in the
I don't know
meantime, do
how
you
long
want to
this
go
takes.
ahead and propose a poll on...
Okay, Shin says he's online. No, I want to hold off on doing the poll until after we have this other presentation, if possible, because it may answer some questions. But I don't see Shin yet. I'm probably saying it wrong. Xiao. I'm saying Xiao.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I hear you,
Yeah.
Chen. Yes.
Yeah, this is Chen. Actually, I do see Xiaomi is online, and I did talk with him, and he will present.
Is he in the NetConf Meet Echo?
Yeah,
Yes.
actually he is. He? I think he's got his last name first. That's...
Okay, I'm going to cancel this presentation and bring up the next presentation then.
Xiaoming, can you queue up to be a speaker? You have to raise your hand. All right, Xiaoming, if you see your name on the top, okay. Is he there? Yes, okay.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, hi, we hear you. I'm going to pass.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to pass
Okay.
slide control to you. You can increment the slides by using the left, right mouse buttons.
Okay. Let me introduce the structure. Problem statement and the use cases of adaptive traffic data collections. Next one.
You should be able to hit your right mouse button or right keyboard button and increment it yourself.
Okay, please turn to the next page.
Okay, I'm going to take back slide control and just tell me when you need to have the slides incremented. Sorry about that. Okay, next slide. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, okay. Motivation and objective. Motivation. IT career network leads to provide real-time traffic visibility to help network operators quickly and accurately look at network congestion and packet loss. Make timely path adjustment for deterministic services to avoid congestion. Persistent sampling at millisecond intervals will generate a considerable amount of data which may claim too much transport bandwidth resource. Overload the service for data collection, storage, and analysis. Objective: explore the adaptive traffic data collection mechanism so as to capture real-time network state at minimal resource consumption. Please, next page. Okay. Problem statement. IP network is of traffic-based characteristics, but for a long time, operators have obtained traffic visibility from MS, which cannot reflect this kind of base characteristics. First, the observed average network traffic masks the characteristics of a traffic-based, given that SMT is widely employed to collect network traffic at 5 minutes intervals. Second, in spite of low links usage, such as 13 to 14% bandwidth utilization, mailing complaints have still been received about poor QoE in delivery during application with the sensitivity of delay and packet loss. A large quantity of laboratory data and operational data indicate that a market-based phenomenon occurs frequently in operators carrier networks, such as IP RAN, IP metropolitan network, IP backbone network, and integrated data centers. By means of telemetry techniques, we can capture the complete X packets of market-based traffic. However, it is impractical to gain the real-time traffic visibility at cost of persistent sampling at milliseconds intervals. Please, the next page. Scenarios of adaptive traffic data collections. Use case 1. Multi-dimensional real-time portrait of interface traffic characteristic. The real-time traffic visibility can help operators better understand network performance so as to achieve SLA guarantees for latency and loss sensitive applications. Obtaining the holistic and genuine characteristic of interface traffic is also a basic requirement for the statistical multiplexing model of IP network, which is of great significance for traffic prediction, network planning, network capacity expansion, and network optimization, and so on. It is essential to explore the adaptive traffic data collection techniques to depict multi-dimensional real-time portrait of interface traffic characteristics at a minimum resource consumption. Next page, please. Use case 2. Market-based traffic detectives. Market-based traffic is instantaneous congestion phenomena occurring frequently in IETF network, where cause critical detail jitter and AV packet loss, which will seriously affect QoE of latency and loss sentence applications. The ability of detecting market-based traffic of interface will help network operators quickly and accurately locate network congestion and packet loss, and make timely path adjustment for deterministic delay services in order to avoid the congested load and links triggered by the events such as packet loss. Q depends beyond the threshold which is detected timeliness. Assembly cycle must be timely equivalent to milliseconds to capture a market-based of interface. The next page, please. Use case 3 congestion avoidance for deterministic services. The real-time traffic visibility based on the adaptive traffic data collection techniques can accurately predict the long-time congestion and quickly capture the instantaneous congestion of the interface. And minutes of the real-time traffic visibility, the automatic optimization tool, for example, AI, can make timely path adjustment for key traffic flows. The next page, please. Use case 4, path telemetry based on adaptive traffic samplings. An adaptive approach can be used based on the network condition to dynamically adjust the sampling rate. In normal network stated, a low sampling rate is enough to reflect network performance. In case of network congestion, timely adjust the packet sampling rate at a very high level so as to acquire real-time measurement data such as latency, jitter, and packet loss. The next page, please. Next steps, solicit comments and refine the draft accordingly. Cooperation will welcome. Possible implementation and verification. That's all. Thank you.
Does anybody have
comments
comments?
or questions? Sorry, Ken.
No, I was saying the same thing. That's perfect. Yes, Benoit, please.
So, Benoit Claes, so thank you for coming to the IETF to express your problems. Now, so when I read the slide, it seemed it's mainly about data plane monitoring, right? And sometimes, it would be easier for me to know if we speak about data plane and then like in-band OEM, like what you described in the last use case, or if you speak about flows, if you speak about something else, as opposed to, just telemetry periodic updates. This is where the use case should be likely more structured, I believe.
All right, thank you. I don't believe there are any other comments. So so we did have to take these last two presentations out of order. The idea was that this presentation was going to provide the use cases that would help justify the potential adoption of the adaptive subscription draft, which was the previous presentation. But now that we have had this presentation, I know I know there were some objections that were raised previously on list by Andy and also Per with regards to concerns with the adaptive subscription draft. And Andy's not online. I don't know. I think I see Per if the use case or other. Oh, Jan is joining the queue. Perfect. Go ahead, Jan. Yes, Jan, please go ahead.
Make sure to
Sorry, I was
unmute
speaking to you.
yourself.
Yeah, Per is not able to speak at this moment, but we are working together. So I think it's perhaps better to discuss the details on the list if possible. But I think many of the concerns we have are still relevant.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, thank you. So I do want to put a show of hands poll to the working group. It's on screen now. Okay, I think we've gotten, I don't see any new, oh, there's one more participant. All right, I'm going to end the poll now because it's pretty much good enough. So we just got 24 participants in that poll. And it's about half in terms of whether or not the working group should, continue looking at adopting this as a proposed standard versus an experimental message. Experimental draft. And so again, this is not an adoption call on either front, but it looks like we'll hold the door open longer for the possibility of it being proposed standard. I think, as Jan just mentioned, more discussion on list needs to occur to try to resolve the concerns of those that have raised them. And I think that's it for that presentation. So thank you very much, everyone. And also, I believe that's the end of the meeting. We're at the end of our agenda now, Mahesh.
Yes.
With 3 minutes to spare.
Yep. All right. Anyway, thanks everyone.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining the NetConf 113 session. Wish I could be there in person. See you in Philadelphia, right?
That is correct.
Okay.